I guess this question's mostly for Jordan Peterson. Just to hopefully enlighten a bit more what you mean by God, do you think that if all humanity were to cease to exist, does God still exist?
I don't think I know how to answer that. It's just, the situation is too hypothetical. I mean, I can take a crack at some of it, but so human beings are characterized by consciousness and by self-consciousness, and the latter in particular seems to be something relatively unique. There's some vague evidence for self-consciousness of lower sorts in animals, but it's not very compelling. Some of them can recognize themselves in a mirror, but our self-consciousness is accompanied by elaborated imagistic and linguistic models of ourselves and that have been elaborated over large spans of time. There are lots of elements of being that would disappear if we disappeared. Now, and it isn't even obvious to what extent that's true, right? Because I don't really understand to what degree being itself is dependent on consciousness. Like the classic materialist Enlightenment view, which I would say is basically a 19th century view, something like that, is that if all consciousness was extinguished, the material substrate of the universe would continue unchanged. But I don't really buy that as an argument, because I think that the material substrate, I think that reality is I think that reality is an interaction between what we perceive of as the material substrate and consciousness itself. And so then when you destroy consciousness, you destroy reality. And what that leaves, I don't really understand, because it doesn't have any temporality in any obvious sense. It doesn't have any size in any obvious sense without the introduction of an invisible observer. So lots vanishes without human consciousness and self-consciousness. I don't know how to answer the question, does God vanish? Because that brings us back into the same problem that I was talking about earlier, is that it's not exactly easy to understand what people are talking about when they say God. You know, because when you ask the question, would God disappear? There's an assumption there that whatever God is understandable and boxable, like a simple concept, like a chair, and that we both share the same conception. And, you know, there's endless warnings in deep religious literature against assuming that you understand what that term means, or sometimes even for using the term. So that's the best I'm going to be able to do with that question.
Thank you.
Hey there. So my question is about something that Matt said, but I'd actually like to get Dr. Peterson to address it first, if that's okay. So Matt, you said that some people are not willing to put in the work of developing sort of their own moral system, and they like turn to religion to free them from the burden of that thought. But doesn't it make sense on some level to view religion as like an archival system that holds truth? Like if we abandon that, are we not then just in a place where everyone is forced to invent their own morality for themselves throughout their life, and then like a baby born has to try to achieve that again? Like that
No.
seems like, from an operative level, just an impossible system to set up that would ever get you anywhere. So I'm just wondering how you would resolve that conflict.
That was Nietzsche's critique, essentially.
Well, I'm not trying to set up the system. I think the system is already set up. So my goal is not to rid the world of religion. That's just a fortunate side effect from my goals. My goal is to have the best understanding of reality that I can, and for other people to do so as well. Now, when I talk about religion, there are things within religious histories, within religious teachings that are passed down, which are true and good and useful. And there's no reason to think that any of those things would go away if we stopped believing in a God, because they are true and good and useful whether there is a God or not. If the thing that we're worried about is, and I've asked people before, and I apologize if anybody's bothered by this, but there are people who are like, oh, if you don't believe in a God, what keeps you from running around raping and killing people? And I was like, so if you became convinced today that your belief in God was unfounded and you were forced by reason to give it up, would you run around and start doing that? And there are people who will say yes, and I hopefully, optimistically don't believe them, but we know that there are people who do that. But the truth about what is good and useful is true whether a particular religion survives or not. And we don't lose that because children aren't born with an understanding of morality. They learn that. They are educated by their parents. They are taught. They explore the world. Everybody does, in fact, go through the effort of creating and understanding their own morality. It's just that we adopt things from figures around us who show evidence that they are smarter and understand this better as a shorthand. We ride on the shoulders of giants. The curious question is, and I ask this for people ostensibly who are Christian, who believe in both a God and a devil, is how did you decide that God was the good one and the devil was the evil one? Because the model is that, well, God wrote his moral code on your heart, and that's how you tell. But if that's the case, then whether or not, if the devil had written his moral code on your heart, you would be saying he was the good one. The truth is, you are using your internal, personal, subjective assessments to determine that God is the good one, or this religion is the right one, or the First Baptist Church got it right, or the Second Baptist Church got it right, or this is the preacher we should hire. This is what we do. And I don't see much value in worrying about, oh, is it all going to go away, when it's clear it doesn't, because secular individuals are no more immoral or criminal-minded than anybody else. In fact, there may be some cases to show that we're less.
But in this society, they are no more criminally minded. Like, we have a religious foundation, right? Like, I wouldn't go around, like, raping and pillaging if I abandoned God, but there were societies that did when they didn't have that structure. So how do you resolve that?
I'm not saying that religious authorities haven't been useful. It's just that what I hear from some people is that we should keep this because of that particular usefulness, because they fear what will happen otherwise, because what they've seen in the past. And I don't buy that, because that boils down to saying, I may not need religion, but you people do. And that is far too arrogant for me to ever adopt as a position.
Okay,
So
I don't want to take up too much time,
quick,
but did you want to speak
I
to
have
that?
a quick comment on riding around on the shoulders of giants, which was the central theme in Matt's answer. We ride around on the shoulder of giants, and the meta-giant is God. That's a very good way of thinking about it.
Except that I can identify.
We can think about that as, I don't care about the metaphysical implications of that. I don't have to care about that at the moment. But if you look at the evolution of the idea of God, for example, and I think this is particularly true with the evolution of the idea of Christ, is that we do ride around on the shoulders of giants, and the figure of Christ, psychologically speaking, is the giant among giants. It's a meta-giant, and it's a ritual model for emulation. And the ritual model is something like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it nobly, which is a metaphysical statement in some sense that lies at the bottom of the ethic even that Matt is presenting. And so it is deeply embedded in a religious substructure. And that's the metaphorical substructure that I was talking about that necessarily underlies these self-evident axiomatic rules, which are not by any means, as you point out, self-evident in the least. There's plenty of cultures that train their young men to be absolutely barbaric monsters, right? Warriors, killers, rapists, right? Bloodthirsty right to the core. Perfectly viable mode of being, arguably speaking, from the perspective of generating a set of axiomatic rules. Why is it not better to have 10,000 women than one? There's an evolutionary question for you. Well, reasonable people wouldn't do that. Oh, yeah, right. Reasonable people. Yeah.
Thank you.
So if it's not clear, I can point to the giants. I can't point to the mega giant.
It's because it's an abstraction.
Sure, but when you hold Christ up as a particular figure, the only information that I have about Jesus comes from the Bible. And rather than going through all of it again, because there's lots of people with questions, If you go to ironchariots.org, you will find a verse-by-verse deconstruction of the Sermon on the Mount where I point out that Jesus gave some good advice and some crappy advice and some questionable advice, and that's not enough. And there's not a secular humanist organization or country on the planet that has ever produced as a good thing, an intentional good thing, rapists and murderers. So,
Well, that's highly debatable. That's highly debatable.
actually,
one of
it's
the things
absolutely true because there's never been a secular humanist government on the planet.
I don't know. I think the Soviets were pretty secular
No,
humanists.
Then,
I know
with all due apologies, you do not know the first thing about what secular humanism is. You should read the Secular Humanist Manifestos, because what happened in Russia, in communist countries, was an institution of a religious-like structure centered around an individual and forced atheism, none of which is consistent with humanism. None of it. And we can talk about this later, and I'll be happy to point you to this, because you can say that it was an atheist thing that went awry, but you can't call it secular humanism. It's just not there. There's no humanism in what was done there. But
I'm one of those who believes that there's no such thing as an atheistic thing or a non-religious thing. I was listening to your talk at Lafayette, Peterson, last night there, and you were talking about how all action is religious. So this conversation today, I think it's hit the same problem you hit with Rebecca Goldstein, you're going to hit with Sam Harris and June, which is I've never found a way to convey to an atheist that we all have an ideal. You can call it God, you can call it a transcendent ideal, call it an axiom, call it a presupposition. It's just very hard to communicate to them that implicitly or explicitly it's there, you're aiming for it, maybe it changes, maybe it doesn't, but it's that fundamental thing that guides your action. And my question would be, you keep, Dillahunty did a very good job of saying pragmatically, okay, fair enough, the axioms could change, maybe we try those, but there's always going to be an axiom. It's a transcendent thing because it's always changing, so we all have that. So again, the definition of God is just kind of useless, but maybe you want to explore why there is a partial definition of God that makes all actions religious, makes all ideals you're approaching for a form of God worship, whether you want to call it that or not. I hope that's coherent.
Well, Carl Jung had some very interesting comments about that. He said, psychologically, for all intents and purposes, your God is the highest value that you have. Right? It serves functionally as your deity. Now, you may not clothe it in a personified manner, although you tend to, because you tend to act it out and assume that other people should too. So it implicitly has a personified form. But if it performs all the functions of a deity, let's say, then it's importantly related in some sense to a deity. And I think that that's actually technically true if you look at how human cognitive structure works. I don't think it's escapable.
Does that make sense to you, Phil, or does that I don't feel I've ever.
no, see, when you said you have difficulty explaining this to atheists, I don't know what atheists you've been talking with, but I'm right on board, and I functionally understand and can agree with this. So secular humanism can easily be viewed as a religion. The U.S. Supreme Court has defined it in the sense of pursuit for ultimate answers to ultimate questions or things like that. But if you want to say that my God is truth or goodness or whatever thing, I'm fine with that in a poetic, even metaphorical sense. The problem is when you talk about if what you believe in fulfills all the roles of a deity, I think you're sidelining what a lot of the roles of a deity have played throughout the entirety of human history, because they're advocating, many of them, not all, most, I would say, are advocating for an actual thinking agent, supernatural, that is the creator and or sustainer of the universe. And nothing about my pursuit of truth or goodness or secular humanism fills that particular role. So already we are cherry-picking the aspects of God traditionally and saying, Matt has these particular aspects that I also attribute to God, and I agree. I just don't have the other ones, and those are the ones that I want justification for.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yes, sir. You have to move up the mic, I believe. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Thank you.
So the question is for Matt. So why is the language of secular humanism, these values that you just espoused, or talked about, why is that better than religious language? And then for Professor Peterson, why would religious language be better than those values?
Yeah, and I don't want to be overly pedantic about, I don't know that the language is necessarily better. The ideals of secular humanism have the goal of getting better. The foundation, if you read, and there's various versions of the Secular Humanist Manifesto, and I have disagreements with all of them, and but the nice thing is that there are revisions. Okay, this is one of the biggest benefits of a model, is how do you convince somebody that Christianity is right? Well, there's coercion, conversion, conquest. How do you
Example.
Sorry?
Example.
Okay.
That's an important one.
Okay. I'll have to think on that some more, because a lot of the things that people do that they think are exemplary or examples of Christianity, I don't think that they're in any way not necessarily tied to Christianity. Like, it's not, there's nothing a Christian could do that is good that I couldn't also do. And so the example thing doesn't work. But with secular humanism, it is through debate, discussion, data, and convincing people. It's not like we're running around saying, we're going to conquer and install this here. We're not going to make a proclamation that we have the one true right answer. The position that secular humanism takes is, as far as we can tell, we get one life. If there's more, hey, bonus, show us, we'll be convinced. It seems that we are, as human beings, as agents, stuck here trying to figure out the best way to live this life. And so we must rely on ourselves and not make appeals to supernatural agents that we can't demonstrate or that don't seem to intervene on our behalf. And if they exist, they're free to come in and step up and tell us where we're doing it wrong. But for now, we're just going to try to do the best we can with what we have to make the world a better place. That's the foundation of secular humanism, not any proclamation that we've got it right.
So I would say that the primary religious language, insofar as there is such a thing, it's something I tried to detail in Maps of Meaning, this first book I wrote. It's a very complicated book. But religious propositions are, in some sense, abstracted generalizations about what being consists of and how to act in it. It's not the same thing as a set of hypotheses about material reality. And it's partly because in the religious domain, the moral imperative is primary, whereas in the empirical domain, the factual domain is primary, or the sensory domain is primary, something like that. So the question from the religious perspective is something like, how should we best construe the world if we wish to determine how to act properly within it? And the way that language is developed, it's developed as a consequence of an evolutionary process, both biological and cultural. And it's culminated in a set of stories, essentially, that have characters. The characters basically represent something like the permanently unknowable. And so that's the mystery that surrounds us all. And that would be associated, say, with the potential of the future and the potential in you. The part of being that's transcendent, right, that constantly escapes from your theorizing. That's the unknown. It's like unexplored territory for animals. And it's a permanent part of being. So there's unexplored territory, the unknown, and there's explored territory, culture, the known, and that's this room, and that's the cultural mores that unite us well enough so that we can all sit here and be peaceful while we're discussing difficult things. So that's the landscape, the religious landscape. That's yin and yang. That's chaos and order. Interestingly enough, it looks like it's to that landscape that our brain has adapted, because the right hemisphere looks like it's roughly responsible for processing chaos and the unknown, and the left hemisphere roughly responsible for processing the known and the familiar. And that's on good evidence. If you don't want to take my word for it, you can read Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, which is quite masterful treatment of the neuropsychological literature. And so that's the religious domain, yin and yang, chaos and order. And it places human beings at the center of that. And the idea is that we're always confronted by what we understand and have to adapt to that, even in its tyrannical manifestation. And we're always faced with the permanent reality of the permanently incomprehensible that can burst into our life at any moment and disrupt it. That's reality. And then the religious question is, if that's reality, how do you orient yourself in relationship to those two permanent domains? And the answer to that is something like, pursue the instinct of meaning. Because it looks like meaning is the instinctive response, neuropsychologically grounded in the orienting reflex, I would say, which is a very primordial reflex to the unknown. Meaning is the response that orients us in that world. And so when we're engaged in a meaningful enterprise, it's a signal from the deepest elements of our biological being that we have the balance between what we know and makes us secure and what we don't know and have yet to explore properly sync. And that makes us secure, but not totalitarian, and engaged, but not terrified. And by staying on that midpoint of balance, that's Tao, by the way, that's the way from the Taoist perspective. By staying on that midpoint, we do what's best for us, what's best for our families, what's best for our community, and God only knows beyond that. We do all of that simultaneously, and we can tell that we're doing that. It speaks to us when we're doing that. And that's the deepest of religious instincts. And it's that capability to orient on that border between chaos and order that's exemplified in great mythological heroes like St. George, who goes out to slay the dragon, or Christ, who welcomes death, who embraces mortality and vulnerability and strives forward nonetheless. And there's nothing outside of the religious language that communicates that kind of grandeur. There's nothing that you can use to communicate to people who are in the direst of straits what's most important about life in the manner that will help set them straight and put their soul at peace. So that's the advantage of the religious language.
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you both for a very interesting and revealing exchange. My question is for you, Dr. Peterson. You alluded to an important distinction between someone who would actually be an atheist and someone who merely professes to be an atheist. You implied that Matt and others are not genuinely atheists. I'm curious why you think that. Is it just because we have sacred values, that everyone has sacred values? What, in your view, would a genuine atheist be like?
He'd be like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. And I can't really come up with a better answer than that because it's such a complicated question that that's the right answer. You know, I love that book. It's an amazing book, and it's a great thriller, by the way. If there are some of you, perhaps many of you, who haven't read it, you really should read it because it might be the greatest novel ever written. I think you can make a case for that. It's unbelievably exciting once you get into it. And Raskolnikov, he plots the perfect murder. It's so interesting because Dostoevsky, the last thing Dostoevsky ever did was make a straw man out of his opponents, let's say. What Dostoevsky did in all of his great novels was make his enemies, let's say, or make each of the positions that he was trying to contend with as powerful and admirable as he possibly could. And since he was an absolutely spectacular genius, he could really do that. And so Raskolnikov plots a murder. And he murders this horrible woman, who's horrible according to everyone who knows her, who also has enslaved her rather mentally feeble niece, and who does nothing but make people miserable consciously all the time. And he does that in order to save his sister from a rather sophisticated form of prostitution, to save himself from starvation so that he can become a great lawyer and help people. right? So Dostoevsky sets up the stage. Here is the perfect situation for a murder, and all of the rational choices point in that direction. And Raskolnikov, who's also sort of torturing himself, or sort of tortured because he's sort of hungry and not very well, not thinking very clearly, he undertakes the murder, and he gets away with it. And before he does it, he berates himself in what I would describe as the negative atheistic style. And he basically says, look, there is every rational reason to split this woman's skull with an axe. Look at all the good I would do. Look at all the well-being I would enhance. And so he does it. And then all hell breaks loose. And what Dostoevsky see, Raskolnikov built himself up to the murder in part by laying out the rational case, but also by saying, well, there's no God. There's no metaphysical reason that's stopping me from committing this act. And there's all these reasons that appear perfectly rational, pushing me in that direction. Perhaps I'm nothing but a moral coward for failing to undertake it. So he does. But what he finds out is that he broke an inviolable moral rule, something that spoke to his own soul, so to speak. And the rest of the book basically involves his sequential post-traumatic unraveling. And the post-traumatic issue is very interesting because one of the things you do see happening with post-traumatic stress disorder is that it very often occurs in people who watch themselves do something of great malevolence. By their own admission, I'm not projecting this onto them. They've watched themselves they've stepped outside the ancient moral code unwittingly and conducted themselves in a manner they cannot reconcile themselves to, and they are permanently broken. So there are works like that, Crime and Punishment, first and foremost, I would say, that do a lovely job of elucidating in narrative form how these self-evident moral presuppositions are necessarily nested inside this broader narrative metaphorical substrate, and that you use your rationality divorced from that metaphorical substrate at your peril. And I believe that to be the case. I think that's an accurate psychological summation.
Thank you. I'm curious if Matt has any thoughts on the matter.
You think?
I have plenty.
So it's rather surprising, and I promise you I don't mean this to be insulting, because I definitely place you considerably higher than most of the apologists that I've engaged with. But there's a common theme from the apologists, and that is, you're not really an atheist because. Now, in Dr. Peterson's case, you're not really an atheist because, in my mind, an atheist is someone who would be a murderer. And so I'm just, rather than saddle you with that, you just think you're an atheist, but really you're not. From other apologists, it's, you think you're an atheist, but you're not, because God's written his moral code on your heart. This is essentially, as far as I can tell, what was expressed in some way, that there's a moral foundation, a moral center that God has imbued people with, and that we all know this, or we all recognize it, or you're not really an atheist, or this is what an atheist would do. An atheist is somebody who doesn't believe there's a God. I am not convinced there's a God. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm convinced there are no gods, although that is a subset of, hey, I don't believe there's a God, and then there's a subset that is, I believe there are no gods. This is, as I've talked about previously, independent of whether or not I can be a moral being or do good things. This is independent from whether or not there's awe and wonder or purpose and meaning in my life. In much the same way that, previously they wanted to kind of say, oh, this is a secular humanist, regime that was just awful. Well, it wasn't secular humanism. There were atheist fans who wrote me that were like, oh man, I can't wait till you do this conversation with Jordan. And I was like, cool. And still, I hope that we have many more conversations as well, because just saying one thing that I find irritating is never going to be enough to get rid of me. But I asked them, Great, I'm not that familiar with him. What is it about him that you like, and what are the concerns? And they came back with a bunch of things. None of them said anything about agreeing with views on religion. They seemed very confused on those things. And so the good news for them is that while he thinks atheists would be murderers, he doesn't actually think you're an atheist. And that is his way of getting around acknowledging things that conflict with his worldview. I don't get to decide who is or isn't a true Christian. I didn't even get to decide that when I was a believer. I definitely don't get to do it now. So if somebody tells me they're a Christian, I'm going to have to accept that. I have a model in my head of what that means. I have a model in my head of what it means to be a Muslim, but I'm willing for them to explain to me what their model is. I know people who identify as Christian atheists. They really love the stuff that Jesus said, but they don't actually believe there's God. You know, Thomas Jefferson famously cut out the Jefferson Bible and removed every reference to the supernatural and miracles and things like that because he really admired the teachings of it. And sure, I think you could be a cultural Christian in that if you wanted to. It's strange to me that I'm not sitting here with somebody like Ray Comfort when I'm told you're not really an atheist because you're too good to be an atheist. And this is what atheists hear all the time when they come out. They've been sidelined because of religious privilege around the world for years. And then atheists come out to their family members or friends or people they've known for years, and they're like, "You're an atheist? How can that be? You're such a good person. I've known you all this time." It's because the mindset of what people have about what an atheist is has been poisoned by religious proclamations. We have been denigrated from the pulpit, and it has seeped into every aspect of culture, right up to the height of intellectual pursuits. And it's time for that to end. And I hate to tell you, you get the last question for us.
Oh, that's so much more pressure
Sorry.
than I can handle.
They're flagging me.
Okay. You want to talk more about consciousness or more about morality?
It's your question, man.
Yeah.
Okay. Morality? Yeah, all right, fine. So,
Yeah, because that'll be quick.
yeah.
Not like consciousness would have been any quicker.
So, Matt, thanks so much for coming back to Toronto. Always great to hear you talk. Dr. Peterson, thanks for coming. Mr. Peterson, you seem sort of very willing to talk about how evolution and biological underpinnings can influence the meta-narrative down the road that, underpins our lives. But can't it also just be that evolution underpins morality without that extra step? Like, isn't it enough that the only animals that evolved are the ones that didn't die, and the only ones that evolved into a society are the ones that could live in a civilized society? Like, isn't it really clear that there are evolutionary underpinnings to morality, and that there are animals that display morality, and that it's not just humans? We're really good at it, but we're not the only ones.
Well, I would say certainly the last part of your statements are true, is that you can see what like morality in some sense is an emergent property of group interactions. It's more complicated than that because it's group interactions across time. It's more complicated than that. You see the clear underpinnings of morality in animals. Sure. You're asking, does there have to be something metaphysical beyond that?
No, I'm saying what
okay.
seems metaphysical to us is just because we're like really faulty analyzers of the real world, like the whole shadows in the grass, type 1 and, like false positives, false negatives. But like, why we wouldn't be a society if we were just naturally disposed to being immoral? Like, morality is entirely selfish. It's really good for me to be moral because my life's really good that way, and it makes me feel really good to be nice to other people. If it felt like shit to be nice to other people, I wouldn't do it.
Well, it
so
does
we evolved
sometimes.
to be moral. There's a reason it makes us feel good.
Well, okay. Look, I'm going to refer to Jung again. Jung did hypothesize that he talked a lot about the God image in human beings, which was distinct from God. And you could say, let's go back to the psychedelic issue. you could say that people can have intense mystical experiences, even intense mystical experiences of a deity directly, let's say, because that does happen, without that being construed as evidence for the existence of a deity, right? The religious instinct could be built so deep into us that we can't get outside it, even if it's just a materialistic instinct.
Well,
That
some
is
of
a
us can get
possibility.
outside it. Like I'm outside of it. and sorry.
Let him finish because we're out of time.
Oh, well,
I wanna-
and I don't really know how to distinguish between those things. I'm not even sure that you can distinguish between them. Now, do I have anything else to say about that in closing? No, I guess I don't. I mean, I tried to lay out these views, the answer to your question, in detail in my first book. It's about 600 pages long. And it's really, 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 really hard. But it does address what you're asking. And I don't think there's a real simpler way of doing it. I didn't find one.
I only have a couple things to add before we close this out. First of all, I have no idea how long my first book's going to be, but it won't be 600 pages. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Also, I don't think I have anything specific to tag on to your question, because I get the impression that we're likely on this similar pages, because I think that the moral, cultural aspects of this are something that happen naturally. We observe in other primates senses of fairness. And the key cornerstones for morality, from my perspective, while I gave an outline for a secular moral system, the foundations of that are empathy and the desire to have a good life. And the last note is, one time when I was on LSD, I was staring at the wood grain on the bathroom door. I don't know why I was in the bathroom, but I was there. And from the wood grain on the bathroom door, an image formed. This is not a joke. It was a strawberry with an S on its chest, and a face and a cape. And Super Strawberry flew off that bathroom door and did a lap around my head before it smacked right into the door and became wood grain again. Coolest trip ever. And despite that, I don't think it points to the reality of Super Strawberry or his abilities. And because that was an incredibly unfair applause line to end the night with, I'd like to let Dr. Peterson give one last remark, and then we will thank you all and say goodnight. So if you have anything to add or close with on anything we've discussed this evening.
Well, I only have one thing to say. I mean, I'm very pleased, for what that's worth, that these sorts of discussions are taking place and that there's an avid public audience for them. It's like, great, you know? Yeah.
And on that note of complete agreement, thank you guys so much for coming out. We really appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you sometimes. We'll come back through. Cheers.
Great job. Thank you. Thank you.